The envelope had no return address. That was the first thing I noticed. No name. No stamp. Just my daughter's name, Nadia, written in blue ink across the front, slipped under my door sometime between Tuesday night and Wednesday morning. Nadia was 9 years old. I stood in the kitchen holding it for almost a full minute before I put it down and made coffee. I told myself it was nothing. A birthday card from a neighbor. A school thing I'd forgotten about. But I didn't open it. Something wouldn't let me. My grandmother, we called her Doddy, had passed 6 weeks before. 81 years old. Sharp until the very end. She'd lived with us for the last 2 years of her life, in the small bedroom at the back of the house with the window that faced the garden she loved. She used to say that house was hers in every way that mattered. She'd helped pay for it when my father was struggling. She remembered every wall that went up. When she died, I grieved quietly. The way she would have wanted. My family, her other children, my aunts and uncles, they came for the funeral, stayed 3 days, cried, ate, made promises about staying in touch, and left. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The calls started 2 weeks after the funeral. My uncle Tariq called my father first. Then my aunt Seema. Then Tariq again. My father would take those calls in the back room with the door closed, which he'd never done before in 20 years. He'd come out quieter than he went in. If I asked him what was discussed, he'd say, estate things. You know how it is. I didn't push. But I noticed. My aunt Seema came to visit one afternoon with her husband and stayed for 3 hours. When I came downstairs, their conversation stopped mid-sentence. My aunt smiled at me in a way that felt practiced. We were just talking about Doddy's things, she said. Her jewelry. You know. Family. Her husband didn't look at me once. A week later, I found a business card in the pocket of my father's coat while I was doing laundry. Haroon Khalil. Family and estate law. I put it back exactly where I found it. That evening, I asked my father if anyone had contacted him about Doddy's estate formally. He said no. He said Seema had just asked about a few sentimental items. He said I was overthinking it. You're overthinking it, he said, and turned back to the television. I nodded. I didn't argue. The envelope sat on my counter for 4 days before I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed. Clean font. No law firm header, but the language was unmistakably legal. It stated that my daughter Nadia, 9 years old, had been named as a beneficiary in my grandmother's verbal estate discussion, but that other parties had since filed a claim contesting the informal nature of that designation. It requested that I contact a named solicitor within 14 days to discuss resolution. There was no signature. No case number. Just my daughter's name, and a phone number at the bottom. I read it twice. Then I folded it back into the envelope and slid it into the drawer beneath the kettle where I keep takeaway menus and expired coupons. That's when I realized something was very wrong. My grandmother had told me, in this very kitchen, 8 months before she died, that she wanted Nadia to have the plot of land in her home village. Not the house. Not the jewelry. Just a small piece of land that had been in her family for 3 generations. She'd said it plainly. Over tea. Without ceremony. I hadn't thought to record it. Why would I? She was my grandmother. We were family. But someone else had been thinking about that land for a long time before she died. And now they'd sent a legal document addressed to a 9-year-old child and slipped it quietly under my door in the middle of the night like it was nothing. Like I was someone who could be managed. So I stopped reacting. And I started watching. I started with the obvious things first. I called the number at the bottom of that unsigned letter. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. A generic recording. No name. No firm. Just a mailbox number and a beep. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I wrote down the number, the date I received the envelope, and a description of the paper itself, the font, the weight of the sheet, the exact wording. I photographed everything with my phone before I put it back in the drawer. Old habit from a job I'd had years ago. Document first. React later. The land my grandmother had mentioned was modest. A few acres in a village neither my cousins nor I had ever actually visited. It had no building on it. No commercial value, as far as I knew. But I started researching anyway. What I found took me about 40 minutes of quiet searching on a Thursday evening after Nadia had gone to bed. The land, it turned out, was not modest at all. A regional development plan, publicly listed on a government infrastructure portal, had earmarked the entire surrounding area for a road expansion project. Land acquisition in that zone had already begun. Compensation rates for private plots had been set at nearly 18 times the agricultural value. 18 times. A piece of land my grandmother had called just soil and memory was now worth something significant. Not generational wealth, but significant. And my family knew. I don't know exactly when they found out. But the timeline made itself clear once I started looking. My uncle Tariq had driven to that village 14 months before my grandmother died. I knew this because he'd mentioned it once at a family dinner, something about checking on Doddy's old things. We'd moved on to another topic within seconds. I hadn't thought about it again until now. Seema's husband, the one who wouldn't look at me during that living room visit, worked in regional construction logistics. I found his company name on a contractor's vendor list in the same government portal. His firm had submitted a preliminary bid for a supply contract connected to the road project. He'd known before any of us. I went back through my grandmother's final months more carefully. She'd been in moderate cognitive decline the last 4 months of her life. Nothing severe. She still knew who we all were. She still made her own tea and remembered her prayers. But her memory for recent events softened near the end. She sometimes repeated questions she'd asked an hour before. I had her medical records. I'd been her primary carer. Every GP appointment, every hospital visit, every prescription refill, I had paper copies of all of it, filed in a red folder in my wardrobe because the NHS letters never stopped coming and I'd learned early to keep everything. What I didn't have was any written record of what she'd said about Nadia and the land. What I didn't know yet was whether someone else had created one. The answer came from an unexpected place. My cousin Hyra, Seema's youngest daughter, 23, who'd always been quiet around her mother, sent me a voice note on a Wednesday morning. She sent it to the wrong contact. She realized immediately and followed it with, "Sorry, wrong person, ignore that." I'd already listened to it twice. In the voice note, Hyra was speaking to someone else. She sounded low. "Careful," she said, "I just don't think it's right, what we're doing with the paper." She was barely, and then she stopped herself and said she'd call later. That was it. 15 seconds. I saved it immediately. Backed it up in 3 places before I finished my morning coffee. The paper. 2 days later, through a contact at a local solicitor's office, a woman I'd done some administrative work for years ago, I learned that a handwritten document had been submitted to a probate process. The document purported to record my grandmother's verbal wishes regarding her estate. It was dated 4 months before she died. During those 4 months, her recall for recent events had been, as her GP's notes confirmed, intermittently compromised. The document gave the land to a family trust. A trust with 4 named beneficiaries. Nadia was not among them. I sat with that information for a full evening. I didn't call anyone. I didn't send any messages. I made dinner, helped Nadia with her reading, watched half of something on television that I couldn't tell you anything about now. What I felt wasn't anger, exactly. It was something quieter than that. A kind of settling. Like a picture that had been slightly tilted finally coming level. They had taken something from my daughter using a document signed by an old woman whose memory was fading. They had done it carefully, and quietly, and with legal language, and they had slipped notice of it under my door in an envelope with no return address. And they were waiting for me to call that voicemail number and ask what we could work out. Confronting them would have ruined everything. The first thing I did was find a solicitor who had nothing to do with anyone in my family. I didn't ask for recommendations. I didn't post in any group or mention it to anyone I knew. I opened a browser in private mode on a Tuesday afternoon while Nadia was at school and searched for estate litigation solicitors in a town 40 minutes away. Far enough. I called 3 offices. Left my name with 2. The third one answered directly. Her name was Ms. Parveen. She had a calm, professional voice and she asked me to bring everything I had. I had quite a lot. I spent 2 evenings organizing what I'd collected without letting it look like I was organizing anything. On the surface, those evenings looked ordinary. Nadia did homework at the kitchen table. I made dinner. I watched television. But after Nadia went to bed, I sat at the small desk in my room and worked quietly and methodically for 2 to 3 hours each night. I had the unsigned envelope, photographed and dated. I had the business card from my father's coat pocket, photographed before I returned it. I had Hira's voice note, saved and backed up to 2 separate cloud accounts and 1 USB drive I kept in my coat pocket. I had my grandmother's GP records, 41 months of them, documenting the progression of her cognitive softening. Dates. Clinical language. A GP's written assessment from the month before the disputed document was supposedly signed, noting that my grandmother was at times uncertain of recent events and may require support for decisions involving complex information. I had the government infrastructure portal records showing the land's projected acquisition value. I had the contractor vendor list with my aunt's husband's company name on it. And I had something else. My grandmother had a habit I'd never thought much about until now. She kept a small notebook by her bed. Pale green cover. She'd had a series of them over the years, the same brand, the same size. She used them for prayers, for lists, for things she wanted to remember. When she moved in with us, she brought 4 of them with her in a fabric bag she kept under her pillow. After she died, I'd packed her things carefully. The notebooks went into a box I'd stored in my wardrobe. I hadn't opened them because it felt too soon. I opened them on the 2nd evening. 3 of the 4 were filled with prayers and small daily notes. Shopping reminders. Names of people she wanted to call. A list of things she was grateful for, written in a mixture of Urdu and English. The 4th one was different. Near the back, in my grandmother's careful handwriting, smaller than usual, like she was being deliberate, there were 4 pages of notes. Dated. Her own dates, written in her own hand. She wrote about the land. She wrote Nadia's name. She wrote that she had told me what she wanted, in this kitchen, over tea, and that she wanted it written somewhere in case she forgot. She had also written, on the last of those 4 pages, that a man, she described him by his physical appearance rather than his name, but the description was unmistakable, had come to visit her one afternoon when I was out and had asked her to sign something. She wrote that she had not understood it fully. She wrote that he had been very kind and that she had not wanted to seem confused. She wrote, "I hope I did not make a mistake." The notebook was dated 11 days before she died. I sat with that page for a long time. I didn't cry. Or if I did, I don't remember it clearly now. What I remember is the stillness of the room. The sound of the house settling. The feeling of something clicking into place that had been loose for weeks. She had known, somewhere in herself, that something had gone wrong. She hadn't had the language for it or the clarity to act on it. So she wrote it down in her green notebook and tucked it in the fabric bag and hoped. She'd left me exactly what I needed. I met with Ms. Parveen on a Friday morning. I brought the red folder, the photographs, the USB drive with the voice note, the GP records, and the green notebook in a plastic sleeve. She looked at everything slowly and carefully without interrupting me. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The notebook alone is significant. Combined with the medical records and the voice note, this is a viable challenge. Possibly more than viable." She explained the process calmly. The disputed document's timing relative to the GP's assessment of my grandmother's capacity would be central. The voice note referencing the paper was corroborating. The land's concealed commercial value established a clear motive. She said it would take time. She said nothing was guaranteed. I told her I understood. What I didn't tell her was how ready I already felt. Not eager. Not angry. Just ready. I drove home and made lunch and picked Nadia up from school at 3:15. She talked the entire way home about a project she was doing on the water cycle. I listened to every word. That evening, my uncle Tariq called. He asked how I was doing. He said the family was thinking about getting together soon. He said it in the tone people use when they're testing the temperature of something without wanting to admit they're testing it. I told him that sounded nice. I told him we should find a date that works for everyone. I kept my voice easy and unhurried. He sounded relieved when we hung up. They thought it was just another day. It wasn't. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early March. I dressed simply. Dark coat. Flat shoes. I brought the folder, the notebook in its plastic sleeve, and a small notepad for my own notes. Ms. Parveen met me outside the building at 9 o'clock. She looked composed and prepared, which helped me feel the same. My uncle Tariq was already inside with his solicitor when we arrived. He saw me across the room and something moved across his face very quickly. Not quite surprise. More like a recalculation. He hadn't expected Ms. Parveen. He hadn't expected the folder under my arm. He'd expected, I think, someone asking quietly for a compromise. Someone who could be managed. He nodded at me. I nodded back. We didn't speak. The process was not dramatic. There were no raised voices. No accusations spoken aloud in the way you might imagine. Estate disputes at this level move through paperwork and procedure, through the careful language of solicitors and the measured questions of a probate officer. But the evidence spoke in its own way, clearly and in sequence. The GP records established the timeline of my grandmother's cognitive state. The probate officer reviewed them without expression, making notes in a margin I couldn't see. The disputed document was examined. Its date was compared against the clinical assessments. The gap between what my grandmother was assessed as capable of understanding and what the document asked her to authorize was, as Ms. Parveen put it quietly and without drama, a matter of significant concern. Hira's voice note was submitted as a supporting exhibit. I had had it professionally transcribed. 15 seconds. I just don't think it's right, what we're doing with the paper. Tariq's solicitor objected. The objection was noted and considered and ultimately did not alter the exhibit's admissibility. Then came the notebook. Ms. Parveen presented it last. She read the relevant pages aloud in a measured, unhurried voice. My grandmother's words in her own handwriting. The description of the man who had come to visit. The land. Nadia's name. The quiet uncertainty of a woman who had felt confused but had not wanted to seem so. I hope I did not make a mistake. The room was very still when Ms. Parveen finished reading. I looked at my hands. Tariq's solicitor requested a recess. They took 20 minutes. When they returned, the tone had shifted in the way that tones shift when people understand that the ground has changed under them. The outcome was not immediate. These things rarely are. But the disputed document was flagged for further investigation on the basis of capacity concerns. The informal trust structure built around it was suspended pending review. A formal inquiry into the circumstances of the document's signing was opened. The land remained in my grandmother's estate, undistributed, while the process continued. 3 weeks later, Tariq's solicitor contacted Ms. Parveen with a proposal. They wanted to discuss a settlement. A recognition of Nadia's claim. Certain terms. Ms. Parveen called me and relayed this in her calm professional voice and then waited. I told her we didn't need to rush. I told her we could let the process continue. She said that was a reasonable position. My Aunt Seema called me once during that period. It was a Sunday evening. She said she'd heard there had been some legal confusion. She said she hoped I understood that nobody had meant any harm. She said family was complicated sometimes. She said she thought we could talk, just the two of us, and sort through things the way family should. I told her I appreciated the call. I told her that Ms. Parveen was handling everything on my end and that any discussions should go through her. There was a pause on the line that lasted several seconds. Then Seema said, "Of course." We said goodbye politely. We have not spoken since. My father came to me about a month after the hearing. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the envelope had sat untouched for 4 days, and he looked older than I remembered him looking. He said he hadn't known about the document. He said he'd suspected something was happening but hadn't asked because he hadn't wanted to know the answer. He said he was sorry. I believed him about not knowing. I was less certain about the rest. But he was my father. And he was grieving too, in his own complicated way, for his mother and for what her death had uncovered about the people around her. I told him it was being handled. I told him Nadia was fine. I made him tea and we sat together for a while without talking about any of it. Some things don't need to be said to be understood. The settlement came through 4 months after the initial hearing. Nadia's claim to the land was formally recognized. The compensation from the infrastructure acquisition, when it eventually came, would go into a trust in her name, managed until she turned 21. Ms. Parveen had structured it carefully. It was protected. I signed the final documents on a quiet afternoon while Nadia was at school. Ms. Parveen shook my hand and said I'd done everything right. I drove home. I picked Nadia up at 3:15. She was in the middle of a new project, something about ecosystems this time, and she talked about it all the way home and through dinner and while I was washing up. I listened to every word. I didn't tell her about any of it. She was 9. She didn't need to carry it. One day, when she's older and the money is hers and she's ready to understand where it came from, I'll sit her down and tell her about her great-grandmother's green notebook and the 4 pages written in careful handwriting near the back. I'll tell her that her Doddy saw something coming and found a way to stop it. I'll tell her that some people protect the people they love quietly, without anyone knowing, and that this is its own kind of strength. The envelope is gone now. I threw it away months ago. The green notebook is in my wardrobe, wrapped in a cloth, in the fabric bag it came in.